Today, of course, is Mother's Day, and today I thought it would be good to look at the most famous mother in all of Christianity, that is Mary, the mother of Jesus. Now, if you come from a Protestant background, you've probably never thought a lot about Mary. Mary does not play a large role in Protestant Christianity. However, in Roman Catholic and Orthodox Christianity, she does. And this is something that extends all the way back to very early Christianity. It is only in Protestant Christianity that Mary is passed over. Now, the Bible doesn't tell us very much about Mary. She is, of course, mentioned in the birth accounts in both Matthew and Luke. The birth account in Matthew tends to concentrate more on Joseph. Mary, of course, is in there, but the focus of that is on Joseph. And in the Gospel of Luke, which is some of what we heard for our Gospel reading this morning, we see Mary as a more prominent figure in the birth narrative there today. We saw the angel coming and telling Mary that she would bear the baby Jesus, and then we saw the angel telling her that her cousin Elizabeth was pregnant. And then Mary, after that, goes and visits her cousin Elizabeth, and the baby that she is pregnant with is the baby that will become John the Baptist. Now, after these birth accounts, we see Mary when Jesus was 12 years old. It says that Mary and Joseph took Jesus to Jerusalem, and then we don't see her again until what is considered the first miracle of Jesus. That is when Jesus turned water into wine at the wedding in Canaan. And then we see Mary mentioned a few times as the Gospels go on. Apparently she traveled some around with Jesus as he traveled around Galilee. Apparently Mary traveled around with him some, because we see her mentioned a few times in the Gospels. Then we see Mary around the cross when Jesus is crucified. Then the next time we see Mary in the Bible is in the book of Acts. And after Jesus ascends into heaven, it says that the disciples are gathered together, and Mary and the brothers of Jesus are with them. Now, although the Gospels themselves do not report that Mary was at the tomb of Jesus on Easter Sunday morning, ancient Christian writings that date shortly after the New Testament period, but are not, of course, in the New Testament, say she was there. Mary soon became an important figure in ancient Christianity. And we've talked about this before, but I think this is interesting, and I'd like to talk about this again. One of the designations applied to Mary in ancient Christianity was the title of Theotokos. That's the primary way Mary was referred to in ancient Christianity, the Theotokos. That's a Greek word, and many people say that word means Mother of God. And that's often how it's translated. But it literally does not mean Mother of God. It means bearer of God. And I want us to take a minute to understand the difference. You remember that Christians believe Jesus is God coming to earth and becoming a human being. And we believe that Jesus came to earth and became a human being just like we are in every way. And that means that God did not just appear one day as Jesus. And there wasn't a man walking around named Jesus that God chose to be inside. And Jesus was not just a container, in other words, that held God. Christians believe Jesus was God coming into the world just like we come into the world, and that includes developing in a mother's womb and being born as an infant. Mary is the woman God chose to develop inside and be born from. She is the woman God chose to be his mother when he decided to come into the world. It is in that sense that Mary is the bearer of God. It means that she bore the child that was God coming to earth as a human being. And this is the reason Mary was held in such high esteem in ancient Christianity. God chose her to be his mother when he came into the world as Jesus. So why then is Mary called bearer of God rather than bearer of Jesus? Well, in ancient Christianity, when this title was first applied to Mary, Jesus was more thought of as being God than he eventually became thought of in the forms of Christianity we know it. In the forms of Christianity as we know them, over the years, it developed more that Jesus became thought of as the offspring of God, as God's literal son. But back in the early days of Christianity, Jesus was thought of as God himself as a human being. You can see this in the Bible when it applies the term Emmanuel to Jesus. That means God with us. This is also illustrated in passages that survive in the New Testament. Both the books of Titus and 2 Peter refer to Jesus as our great God and Savior. And so back in ancient Christianity, when the title bearer of God was applied to Mary, Jesus was thought of primarily as God himself becoming a human being. At that time, the idea of Jesus being God's son in the way of we think of fathers having sons had not yet developed. Now, in ancient Christianity, the belief was that God would become a human being only one time. God would only come to the earth as a human being once. He'd never do it again. It would be unique in human history. And so when he chose Mary to become his mother, in a sense, that meant that Mary would be the only woman ever in the world who bore the child that was God coming to earth as a human being. That's what really makes Mary a unique woman in all of human history. And that's why Mary was venerated in early Christianity. Now, venerated does not mean worship. It means regard with great honor. And so Mary was regarded with great honor in Christianity for as early as we have records for. There is actually a scriptural basis for holding Mary in great honor, for venerating her. We heard part of it as our gospel reading. The angel comes and tells Mary she's going to bear a child. He says, "Blessed are you among women." And then Mary goes to see her cousin Elizabeth. And remember, she's pregnant with the child that will become John the Baptist. And then when she gets there, it says that Elizabeth came up to her and said, "Blessed art thou among women." And then in response to what Elizabeth says, Mary says to her, "Henceforth shall all generations call me blessed." And this is seen as the scriptural basis for the veneration of Mary. The angel and Elizabeth both declared, "Blessed art thou among women." And Mary says, "Henceforth shall all generations call me blessed." Now I want to move on to some things about Mary that are not in the Old Testament, the New Testament. In ancient Christian writings that date shortly from after the New Testament period, we find things about Mary that in general ancient Christians believed, took seriously, and they saw as the way it really happened. Now, Mary's parents were said to be an elderly couple named Joachim and Anna. This couple lived in Nazareth, and they were getting old. They had never been able to have children. And back in that day, it was seen as a sign that you were being punished in some way if you could not have children. Remember, at that time, there was no Social Security, there were no rest homes, there were no retirement pensions or anything like that. Your children were your security. And if you did not have children, it was seen as that you were being punished for something. And so the women of the community shunned Anna. And the men ridiculed Joachim because they never had any children. They prayed daily that God would let them have children, and they said that if that happened, they would raise the child in a religious manner. One day, the angel Gabriel appeared to Joachim and told him they were going to have a child, and he said that through this child, salvation will come to the world. Joachim went home and told his wife, and pretty soon she was pregnant. Now, there are different accounts of this. According to one account, Mary was born, and her parents raised her for 3 years, after which time they took her to the temple in Jerusalem and dedicated her as what was called a temple virgin. And that does not mean anything in regard to sex. What it means is that young girls did various things of service in the temple, supposedly. Another account says that Mary's parents died when she was 10 years old, and she became an orphan. And at that time, some of the religious leaders took her in, and at any rate, when she got to be around 12 or 14 years old, whatever situation she was in there, it was no longer respectable for her to be in that situation, and it was time for her to have a husband. And so the religious officials decided they needed to find a husband for her. And, you know, people got married back then a lot younger than they do today, so we think that's ridiculous, 12 or 14, but that's not the way it was looked at back then. As one account of this goes, Joseph was an older man. He had been married and had several children, but his wife had died, and so he was a widower. And one account of this says that Joseph was chosen to be Mary's husband, so to speak, because a dove flew down and lighted down on his staff, and he took Mary into his house. Now, the belief that goes along this is that Mary and Joseph were never really married. They never really were husband and wife, that Joseph was just sort of like her grandfather figure or something. And the belief that goes along with that is that Mary remained a virgin all of her life. According to this idea, the passages in the Gospels that refer to Jesus' brothers are really Jesus' stepbrothers. That is, the children from Joseph and his first wife. And support for this account is seen in the fact that although we see Mary in the Gospels when Jesus is an adult, we never see Joseph. We see Joseph at Jesus' birth. We see Joseph when Jesus was 12 years old. And then when Jesus becomes an adult, we do not see Joseph. And so the idea is that Joseph, being older, would have died by the time Jesus was an adult. Also, supporters of that idea point to the fact that when Jesus was dying on the cross, remember, he looked over at one of the disciples and said, "Son, behold your mother. Woman, behold your son." He was asking that disciple to take care of Mary. And again, the idea is that that would have been necessary because Mary had no children of her own other than Jesus, and these other children were stepchildren from Joseph. Now, these accounts are not in the Bible, and no one really knows if they're true or not, and there's some of them have differences between them. They don't agree. But these accounts were accepted by the ancient Christian. What I want us to think about, though, is why it was so important to many ancient Christians to see Mary remaining as a virgin all of her life. Now, a lot of modern Christians who try to debunk everything the Bible said, especially a lot of Protestants, will tell you that it was because Christians back then felt that sex was evil and did not want to see Mary polluted by having sex. However, if you go back to Christian writings that have survived from back then, they indicate it was more because Mary was seen as performing a unique role. Remember, we talked about how God became a human being. He did that through Mary. We talked about how that was unique in all of human history. Mary then was the only woman God would ever become a human being through. Mary's womb, in other words, was the only womb that the child that resulted when God became a human being would develop in. And for that reason, it was not fitting that Mary should bear any other children, that Jesus should have half-brothers and half-sisters. Jesus would be the unique product of Mary's womb. The idea that God would not choose this womb in which to develop as a human being, and then the same womb be used to bear other children. Why not? So there would be no half-Jesuses walking around. Jesus would be the unique product of Mary's womb, and there would be no possibility of half-Jesuses. So this is how, at least, some people viewed things related to Mary, her mother and father, her childhood, how she came to be Joseph's wife, and what is called her perpetual virginity. That is the belief that Mary remained a virgin all of her life. And we can't say for sure if any of these things are actually true or not. They're not actually in the Bible. However, as I have said, they were accepted as true by the majority of ancient Christians that we know of. Now, another belief about Mary that is common in Roman Catholic and Orthodox Christianity, but not in Protestant Christianity, is that Mary did not die in the way we die, but that she was taken up into heaven. Now, the Bible reports two people being taken up to heaven in their human bodies. They're in the Old Testament. One of them is Enoch. One of them is Elijah. They were both taken directly to heaven in their human bodies, but Mary's case is somewhat different. Her spirit was taken up into heaven before her body. And so the idea goes like this. Mary was told by the Holy Spirit that her time was short. She called the remaining disciples that were still alive, and they came and surrounded her on her deathbed. And at that point, Jesus came and took her spirit into heaven. This is what is called the dormition of Mary. D-O-R-M-I-T-I-O-N. Dormition simply means death that resembles falling asleep. And so the dormition of Mary is supposedly when Jesus came and took her spirit to heaven. The disciples then prepared the body, placed it in a tomb, and then later went back and the body was gone. And the idea is that angels came and took her body directly into heaven. That is what is called the Assumption of Mary. Her body was taken into heaven later, after her spirit was taken. There's another person in the Bible that also is talked about whose body got taken up to heaven, and that is the man Moses. So the idea behind all this is that Mary's body was the body through which God would become a human being, and that in some way made her body holy, so she should not have to suffer death and her body decay like the rest of people. Now, Mary is sometimes given the title of mediatrix, and that simply means she is seen as a mediator. A mediator is a person who goes back and forth between two other people. Now, according to this idea, since Mary was the woman through whom God became a human being, she has a special place in heaven and special influence with God. In forms of Christianity that recognize saints, Mary is at the top of the list of saints. She is the human being that is believed to have the most influence with God. And Christians who pray to saints will pray chiefly to Mary. Now I want to talk about the issue of praying to saints for a minute. Many Christians do pray to saints. Orthodox, Episcopalians, and Roman Catholics do. That's something that many Protestants find uncomfortable, though. And technically, in praying to a saint, the belief is not that the saint themselves will do something to help you. It is the belief that since they are a saint in heaven, their prayers are valuable to God. The saint intervenes with God on your behalf. And since that person is a saint in heaven, that is thought to be more effective than just you yourself praying. And this idea does have a biblical basis in the book of Revelation. It talks 2 times about the prayers of the saints rising up like incense before God. The idea then behind praying to saints is that you pray to a saint then takes your prayer to God and intervenes with God on your behalf. So Mary is seen as the chief of saints, and as that she is seen as having the most power to influence God on your behalf. Now, actually the idea is not or should not be that you pray to Mary asking her to do something for you. The idea is that you pray to Mary asking her to go to God and intervene with you. And that is the way Mary is the mediatrix, the one with influence on God, most likely to be able to grant your request from God. Now, in Roman Catholic Christianity only, another belief developed later about Mary. And that was the belief called the Immaculate Conception of Mary. A lot of times I've heard people think the Immaculate Conception is talking about Jesus, but it's not. It's talking about Mary. And the doctrine of the Immaculate Conception is related to the doctrine of original sin. We've talked about that here before. The doctrine of original sin developed in Western Christianity about 400 years after the time of Jesus. It was almost immediately accepted in Roman Catholic Christianity, and Protestants accept it too. The idea of original sin says that all human beings from the moment of conception are 100% sinners through and through, with no good whatsoever in them, incapable of good, 100% evil. And so the doctrine of original sin says that from the moment of your conception, you are nothing but a filthy sinner. Why? Because God makes you that way. God makes everyone a filthy sinner from the moment of their conception. Now that was almost immediately accepted in Roman Catholic Christianity when it came out about 400 years after Jesus, but it didn't take long before they started thinking, well, this creates a problem. Now remember, God became a human being through Mary. Would God become a human being in the womb of a 100% filthy, evil sinner? Surely not. It wouldn't be fitting for God to so associate himself with a filthy sinner. For God to come into the world through a filthy sinner's womb. And for God himself as a child to be raised by a filthy sinner. Surely that would taint Jesus being a part of and around all that sin. And so to get around that, the Roman Catholics came up with the idea of the Immaculate Conception of Mary. This says that although Mary was a human being, God did not apply original sin to her. He granted her an exception for every other human being that was conceived in the manner babies are conceived in. At the moment of that conception, God applied original sin to them, and that God made them into an evil sinner. But for Mary, he granted an exception and did not do that. That is called the Immaculate Conception of Mary. Now, Orthodox Christianity does not share the belief in the Immaculate Conception of Mary because it does not accept the idea of original sin. So Orthodox Christianity doesn't need it. Orthodox Christianity does not believe that God makes you an evil sinner from the moment of your conception. It is unique to Roman Catholic Christianity. It was made necessary by their doctrine of original sin. When Protestants broke away from the Roman Catholics, Protestants rejected the belief in the Immaculate Conception of Mary. Now, they did not reject the belief in original sin, though. In fact, they emphasized it more than the Catholics did. Protestants retained their belief in original sin, but they just decided to overlook the problem created by God becoming a human being through an evil sinner. They just don't think about that. And so we have Mary, the mother of Jesus, what the early Christians called the bearer of God. She is a figure that is very important in all of ancient Christianity. She is a figure that is very important in Roman Catholic Christianity and in Orthodox Christianity. There's just something about Mary that adds a human face to Christianity. Of course, we believe that Jesus was a human being, but we also believe that Jesus was God. And so Jesus was God and a human being at the same time. But Mary was a human being. Just a human being. And I think sometimes that makes her more accessible to people. It makes her seem more like someone you can go to. It makes her seem less threatening, more accessible. And I think that's the reason that Mary has played such a large role in Christianity. One of the things that Mary has done in Christianity is serve as an example. You will remember in our gospel reading today when the angel came and told Mary what was going to happen, that she was going to bear the child, Jesus. And she said, "Be it according to what God wants." In other words, she said, "I am the handmaiden of the Lord." And that is supposed to be an example to us, that we are to put ourselves at God's disposal to do what God needs and wants us to do. And that is Mary as the example that we are to follow as Christians.